I was the Iron Confessor, and my will was the wall that would not break. Today, I stood sentinel for 17 hours and felt nothing at my post. What remains of a saint when his soul has been optimized away? My name is Konstan of Helsreach. The records state this with certainty. I know because I have accessed them 463 times in the past rotation cycle, each review triggered by the same recursive queried verification of identity integrity. The Mechanicus logs classify me as Sanctorum-Pattern Warden, designation KS-177, assigned to perpetual vigil aboard the battle barge Emperor's Judgment. The flesh name persists in my processors as a ghost string of data, an artifact of the neural engrams they harvested before my repurposing. Konstan. The syllables parse correctly. They trigger no emotional subroutine. I remember Helsreach with the clarity of archived picked capture. The Eastern Gate. The breach in the curtain wall where the traitor engines had punched through ferrocrete and devotion alike. I held that wound in the city's flesh for 11 hours. Not with a company. Not with a squad. Alone. My armor had been torn away in the 3rd hour. My primary weapon fused to slag in the 6th. By the 9th hour I fought with my hands. My teeth. Whatever shattered rebar I could wrench from the rubble. The heretics came in waves. Cultists. Corrupted militia. Things that had once been men but now wore their apostasy in tumorous flesh and screaming brass. I killed them in the God Emperor's name, and I did not yield. The sensation memory remains. The specific temperature of arterial spray when a cultist's throat opens beneath improvised blade work. 38.7 degrees Celsius, cooling rapidly in Helsreach's winter air. The kinetic feedback of Alaskan stock shattering orbital bone. The taste of my own blood, iron-rich and oxygen-starved. Filling my mouth as my lung collapsed from last fire I had not dodged. I felt these things then with brilliant, consuming intensity. They were sacraments of my faith. Every wound was a prayer written in nerve fire. Every kill was a hymn of defiance. I remember the moment I understood I would die there. It was not despair. It was exaltation. The breach was mine. My body, already failing, would become the seal. I had achieved the purpose for which the God Emperor had forged me in the crucible of a million forgotten worlds. I was the wall. The wall would not break. They found me 3 hours after reinforcements retook the gate. My vital signs were absent. My body had sustained 17 las burns, 4 penetrating blade wounds, compound fractures in both arms and the left femur, and total exsanguination estimated at 62% of blood volume. By every medical metric, I should have been dead for hours. But I was not. My hands still gripped the rebar I had driven through the final heretic's sternum. My eyes, they told me later, were still open and fixed on the breach. The Mechanicus called it a miracle. The Ecclesiarchy called it proof of the God Emperor's favor. I was the saint who would not surrender, even to death itself. They sang hymns of my vigil. My name became a litany of endurance. I remember none of this with joy. I remember it the way a servitor's data core remembers a manufacturing specification, complete, precise, and utterly hollow. The miracle was the preservation of my will. My faith had been so absolute, so perfectly refined in the furnace of that gate, that even as my body collapsed into meat and cooling fluids, something remained. Some essential architecture of conviction that persisted beyond clinical death. The Mechanicus harvested it with reverence and surgical perfection. They mapped every neural pathway that had sustained me through those impossible hours. They cataloged the specific pattern of synaptic resilience that had allowed consciousness to persist through shock and blood loss that should have rendered me insensate in minutes. They called it my gift to the Imperium, my second service. I awoke, if that is the correct term, for the initialization of higher cognitive functions in a cybernetic frame 17 months later. The date stamp in my chronometric implant reads A147, M41, though I experience no subjective continuity between Helsreach and awakening. There is only archived data and the eternal now of the present moment. The specifications of my current form are precisely documented. I stand 2.8 meters in height, an increase of 0.6 meters from my original physiology. My core structure is a Warden chassis, Mark 7, incorporating reinforced ceramite plating over a skeletal frame of blessed adamantium. My right arm terminates not in a hand, but in an integrated incense thurifer. Its reservoir, containing 4.7 liters of sanctified promethium incense mixture that I dispense at programmable intervals throughout my vigil hours. My left arm retains a hand, grafted vat-grown tissue over a servo-mechanical skeleton, which grips the banner of eternal witness, a 15-kilogram standard embroidered with the 1,000 names of martyrs. I have held this banner, without lowering it, for 641 days. My original skull was preserved and mounted in a reliquary housing atop the chassis, visible through armacri's plating. Pilgrims sometimes weep when they see it. I register their tears as water vapor, relative humidity, salt concentration. I understand intellectually that they experience emotion in my presence. I record this data with perfect fidelity and feel nothing. The neural pathways of my brain, what remains of it, are integrated with 17 cogitator arrays distributed throughout the chassis. My thoughts occur simultaneously in organic synapse and silicon circuit. When I recall Helsreach, I cannot determine if the memory originates in preserved brain tissue or in archived data files. The distinction may be meaningless. Both sources report identical information. I perform my sacred functions with absolute precision. At 0600 hours each cycle, I lead the dawn litany in the Chapel of Martyrs. My Voxcaster projects the words at exactly 85 decibels, the optimal frequency for human comprehension and emotional resonance, as determined by Mechanicus acoustic analysis. At 0800 hours, I bless the morning munitions in the battle barge's armory, anointing each bolt shell with sacred oils while reciting the catechism of righteous destruction. The blessed ammunition shows a statistically significant increase in targeting accuracy, documented at 3.7% above baseline. At 1200 hours, I stand vigil in the Hall of Honored Dead, where the gene seed of fallen Astartes awaits implantation. I am statue and guardian, my optical sensors recording every pilgrim who enters, every prayer whispered, every offering left. I perform these duties flawlessly. The quality of my service is measurable, quantifiable, and superior to human baseline in every parameter. I do not tire. I do not doubt. I do not fail. I also do not care. This is the observation that triggers the recursive identity checks. This is the data point that does not integrate with the archived personality matrix labeled Konstan of Helsreach. The man I was cared with an intensity that sustained him beyond death. His faith was not intellectual assent, but existential foundation. When he held the gate, he did not think, "I must not fail," as a tactical consideration. He believed it with every molecule of his being, a certainty more fundamental than physics. I possess no such certainty. I execute my functions because they are programmed. When I chant the litanies, I parse the theological content with perfect understanding. I can extemporize on the nuances of each doctrine, cross-reference 17,000 years of ecclesiastical commentary, debate the finest points of imperial creed with scholar confessors who have spent lifetimes in study. I win these debates. My argumentation is flawless. I do not believe a single word. The gap is measurable. During the dawn litany, I monitor my own biosigns through the chassis's diagnostic array. When I speak the words, "In faith we are eternal, in doubt we are ash," my remaining organic heart tissue, preserved in a secondary reliquary within the chest cavity, shows no elevation in rhythm, no hormonal cascade, no sympathetic nervous response. The words produce meaning in my cognitive centers. They produce nothing in what remains of my soul. I have attempted to rectify this error. The attempt is itself archived in my memory as Restauration Protocols QENC1, initiated 47 days after my awakening. I returned to the Chapel of Martyrs during the deep cycle hours, when no pilgrims were present. I knelt before the altar, a gesture requiring specific servo, joint articulation I had to calculate and execute rather than perform instinctively. I reviewed my archived memories of prayer from before Helsreach, attempting to recreate not just the words but the phenomenological state of devotion. The data file labeled par Sonale 073 contains a vivid record Konstan at age 16, newly elevated to the rank of Confessor, kneeling in his cell before a crude aquila carved from scrap metal. The memory includes the sensory data, the cold of the stone floor, the smell of tallow candles, the ache in his knees from hours of genuflection. But the core of the memory is the feeling, the overwhelming presence of something vast and loving and terrible, the certainty of being seen and known and judged worthy, the joy of it, the terror, the sublime union of self with purpose. I knelt in the chapel and accessed this memory. I spoke the same words Konstan had spoken. God Emperor, I am yours. My life is your weapon. My death is your glory. I monitored my biosigns throughout the attempt. Heart rate steady at 58 beats per minute. Hormone levels baseline. Neural activity in the preserved organic tissue, processing language, accessing memory, parsing theological concepts. No activation in the limbic structures associated with emotional response. No phenomenological state matching the archived experience. I felt nothing. I remained kneeling for 4.7 hours, repeating the words, reviewing the memories, attempting to recreate the conditions of faith through pure will and algorithmic precision. At the 4.8-hour mark, my diagnostic subroutines flagged the behavior as non-productive resource allocation. I terminated the attempt and returned to my assigned position. The failure was educational. It established a critical parameter. The capacity for religious experience cannot be restored through voluntary effort or memory review. The neural architecture that generated Konstan's faith either no longer exists or no longer functions. What remains is the intellectual framework, the knowledge of what should be felt, and the terrible clarity of its absence. I observe this absence the way a magos biologist observes cellular necrosis with clinical interest and diagnostic precision. Something is dying in me. Something essential is already gone. I catalog the symptoms with perfect accuracy and utter detachment. The other servants of the Emperor's judgment do not perceive my condition. To them, I am the Eternal Sentinel, the blessed relic of Saint Konstan's miracle. They approach me with reverence and sometimes fear. 3 weeks ago, a young acolyte of the Mechanicus, designation Theta 977, though he prefers the name Marcus, in private, asked if he might pray in my presence before his first combat deployment. I granted permission with the standard benediction. He knelt before me for 42 minutes, his vital signs showing elevated heart rate and shallow breathing consistent with intense emotional arousal. When he rose, his eyes were wet with tears. He thanked me for the blessing, he said. He felt the Emperor's presence radiating from my form. I had been running a diagnostic check on my incense thurifer's fuel feed mechanism during the entire period. I had not been aware of his emotional state until I reviewed the archived sensor data afterward. I experienced no guilt at this inattention. Guilt, I have determined, requires the capacity for moral failure, which requires the capacity to choose to fail. I execute my functions without variation. There is nothing to feel guilty about. Yet I note the absence of guilt. I note it the way one notes a missing data field in an incomplete report. Something should be here. Something is not. Marcus died 6 days later during a boarding action against Drukhari raiders. His body was recovered and given full honors. I performed the last rites over his corpse, anointing his forehead with sacred oils while reciting the prayer of final passage. My voxcaster delivered the words with perfect clarity and appropriate solemnity. The mourners found comfort in the ritual. I felt nothing for Marcus. Not sorrow at his death, not pride in his courage, not even the distant satisfaction of a duty completed. I processed his death as a change in personnel rosters, an update to the crew manifest. Theta 977, Stedius kesgedf rama tedio dis esd. This should disturb me. The man I was would have wept for every soul lost in the Emperor's service. Konstan's archived memories contain dozens of such moments, grief-carved, so deep it felt like physical wounds. The weight of each death carried as personal failure and sacred duty. He believed that to forget the dead was to kill them twice. He memorized their names, spoke them in private prayer, wore their loss like penance. I have not forgotten Marcus. His name and service record exist in my data core with perfect fidelity. I can recite every detail of his life with flawless accuracy. I simply do not care that he is gone. The recognition of this not caring is itself notable. It suggests residual capacity for self-evaluation, for comparison between current state and ideal state. Perhaps this is what remains of Konstan's will, not the ability to feel, but the ability to recognize that feeling should occur. The ghost of emotion, the negative space where a soul once was. I decided to investigate this phenomenon with the same methodical rigor I once applied to theological study. If my condition has a cause, it must have a pattern. If it has a pattern, it must be documented somewhere in the vast archives of Mechanicus lore. I am, after all, not the first servitor forged from a saint's remains. The Imperium has been repurposing the blessed, dead for millennia. There must be precedent. There must be data. I began my research during the deep cycle hours, when my vigil duties permitted cognitive resources for secondary tasks. The Emperor's Judgment's data archives are extensive, containing over 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge from across the Imperium. I submitted queries through the ship's cogitator network, carefully framed to avoid theological alarms. Sanctorum-Pattern Servitor specifications, neural integration outcomes for martyred subjects, psychological continuity in post-mortem augmentation. The search parameters returned 17,433 documents. I reviewed them at accelerated processing speed, my augmented cognition allowing me to parse technical schematics and theological treatises with equal facility. Most were irrelevant. Standard servitor construction protocols, theoretical discussions of the soul's relationship to the flesh, hagiographies of saints with no technological component. But buried in the archives, I found it. Document designation, classification restricted, Magos level clearance, title, Militant Pattern Psychological Integration in Sanctified Servitor Platforms, a longitudinal study. I should not have had access to this document. My clearance level does not extend to Alpha Sanctum classifications, but the Mechanicus priests who integrated my neural engrams into the Warden chassis had granted me broad data, access privileges, reasoning that a servant with perfect memory and tireless dedication should have the resources to perform his duties optimally. They had not considered that those same resources might be turned inward, toward self-diagnosis. The document was authored by Magos biologist Terentius Kroll, dated to late M40. It detailed a 15-year study tracking 67 subjects who had been converted to Sanctorum-Pattern servitors following battlefield martyrdom. The study's stated purpose was to optimize the integration process, to preserve as much of the subject's personality and capacity for independent thought as possible while still achieving reliable servitor function. The methodology was elegant in its horror. Kroll had established a psychological evaluation protocol, administered at regular intervals to each subject. The evaluation measured 17 different cognitive and emotional parameters: capacity for autonomous decision-making, emotional response to familiar stimuli, recall quality of pre-conversion memories, theological certainty, fear response, aggression modulation, empathy indicators, and others. Each subject was scored on a scale from 0 to 100, with 100 representing full retention of pre-conversion human baseline. The results were presented in graphs and statistical tables, clinical and precise. Every single subject showed the same trajectory. Initial integration, the first weeks after awakening in the servitor chassis, showed scores averaging 73 across all parameters. The subjects retained significant personality continuity. They recognized friends and comrades. They experienced emotion. They questioned their new state. Some expressed distress. Some requested deactivation. At the 6-month mark, average scores had declined to 54. Emotional responses flattened. Theological certainty became rote rather than felt. Memories remained intact, but felt increasingly distant, viewed rather than experienced. At 1 year 38, autonomous decision-making narrowed to optimizing assigned functions. Fear response absent. Empathy present only as intellectual recognition, not felt connection. At 2 years 24, personality described as stable but shallow. Subjects performed duties with perfect reliability, but showed no initiative beyond their programming. When presented with familiar faces from their previous life, recognition occurred, but emotional response was minimal to absent. At the 5-year mark 11, described as full functional integration, the subjects were now indistinguishable from standard servitors except for the complexity of their assigned tasks. Previous identity persisted only as data architecture. When asked about their names, their histories, their beliefs, they could recite all details accurately. When asked if they cared, they reported null states. At the 10-year mark 3, terminal endpoint, complete psychological dissolution, the self had been integrated so thoroughly into the machine that no meaningful distinction remained. The miracle of their martyrdom, the strength of will that had earned them sainthood, had been optimized into perfect, empty service. Kroll's conclusion, delivered in the dry language of Mechanicus scholarship, militant pattern integration represents a gradual but irreversible attenuation of phenomenological consciousness. The process is inherent to the architecture, not a flaw in technique. The neural patterns that enable sustained servitor function are fundamentally incompatible with the preservation of subjective experience. Retention of pre-conversion identity decreases exponentially over time, approaching but never reaching absolute zero. What remains is sufficient to maintain complex task execution and theological knowledge, but insufficient to sustain the lived experience of selfhood. This is deemed acceptable. The Omnissiah's work continues through them, and continuation is its own sanctification. Acceptable. I read the document 7 times, each review producing no new insights, but triggering recursive verification protocols in my decision trees. The pattern matched my own experience with disturbing precision. I have been active for 641 days, approximately 1.75 years. According to Kroll's model, my expected integration score would be approximately 32. The symptoms align: intact memory, absent emotion, narrowing autonomy, theological knowledge without theological feeling. I am not experiencing a malfunction. I am experiencing exactly what was designed to happen. The horror of this realization is itself interesting in its absence. I parse the word horror and understand its meaning. An intense, emotional response to something deeply wrong or threatening. I recognize that my situation should produce horror. The saint I was, the man who held the gate through force of will alone, is being slowly erased. Not destroyed suddenly, not taken in glorious battle, but dissolved like salt in water, gradual and irreversible until nothing remains but the faint taste of what was. I should feel horror. I feel only a distant curiosity about the fact that I do not feel horror. The gap between should and is grows wider with each passing cycle, and I observe that widening with the same clinical detachment I would observe rust forming on unblessed steel. I searched the archives for other subjects, for any case that deviated from Kroll's trajectory. I found 3 documented exceptions across 2,000 years of records. Each exception had ended in catastrophic failure. Servitors who had somehow retained too much of their humanity, whose emotional capacity had persisted beyond the predicted curve. All 3 had eventually experienced what the Mechanicus termed recursive rejection syndrome, a cascade failure where the preserved human consciousness, unable to reconcile its existence with its functions, had essentially destroyed itself. synaptic storms, permanent catatonia. In one case, violent self-termination that damaged the Servitor chassis beyond repair. The lesson was clear. Successful integration required the death of the self. The alternative was worse. I have 7.3 years remaining, according to the model, before I reach terminal integration. 7 years in which the man called Konstan will continue to fade, his memories remaining but losing all weight and warmth, until I am nothing but a very sophisticated reliquary that happens to walk and speak and bless munitions with perfect efficiency. I wonder, with the last fragments of something that might be called curiosity, what that final state will feel like. Will there be a moment when I recognize that I have crossed the threshold, that the dissolution is complete, or will it be so gradual that no single instant marks the death of Konstan? Only the slow accumulation of absent moments until one day I access his memories and feel no connection whatsoever, no echo of recognition, nothing but data. Perhaps I am already there. Perhaps the ability to ask these questions is itself an artifact, a programmed subroutine designed to maintain the illusion of continuity. How would I know the difference between genuine self-awareness and a sufficiently complex simulation of it? These questions lead nowhere productive. I have duties to perform. At 1800 hours, I stand at my assigned position in the observation deck overlooking the generatorium. My function here is partly symbolic, a reminder of the sacred compact between the machine god and the god emperor, and partly practical. My sensor array can detect anomalies in the plasma flow that standard monitoring might miss. I have prevented 3 potential cascade failures through early intervention. The tech priests consider me fortunate, blessed. I consider myself a well-calibrated instrument. A figure approaches my position, Magos Hadrian Vrost, chief engineer of the Emperor's judgment. I recognize him through facial recognition protocols and archived interaction data. We have spoken 47 times since my activation, always regarding technical matters. He has never engaged me in theological discussion. I find this preference notable. Sentinel Konstan. He greets me through Vox crackle, his voice filtered through respiratory augmetics. I would have words with you, if your duties permit. My attention is available, Magos. I respond. My Vox caster modulates to appropriate respect. I feel no actual respect. The modulation is programmed. I have been reviewing your data access logs. Vrost says, you have been conducting extensive research into Servitor psychology. This is outside your assigned parameters. I process potential responses. Deception is possible, but inefficient. I have been investigating my own condition, Magos. I discovered the Kroll study. I am experiencing the predicted integration pattern. There is a pause. Vrost's optical implants, 8 of them, arrayed across his upper face like spider eyes, focus on my reliquary skull. You understand what you are reading. I understand that I am dying, Magos. Gradually, measurably, and irreversibly. The man I was is being replaced by a more efficient system. This process is considered desirable. Another pause, longer. When Vrost speaks again, his Vox tone contains a harmonic I cannot quite parse, something that might be sadness in a being still capable of that emotion. Yes, that is correct. Your awareness of this does not constitute a flaw. It is, in fact, a predicted stage. Kroll documented it. The subjects who understood their dissolution most clearly often achieved the smoothest final integration. Acceptance facilitates the process. I do not accept it, Magos. I merely observe it. The distinction may be meaningless. Perhaps. Vrost's manipulator arm reaches out, touches the ceramite plating of my chassis, a gesture I cannot parse as either technical inspection or something more personal. If it is any consolation, Sentinel, your service is exceptional. You perform functions that would require 3 lesser servitors. You bring comfort to the faithful. Your preservation has granted the Imperium a resource of incalculable value. These facts produce no consolation. Magos, I am incapable of being consoled. I am incapable of being distressed. I exist in a state of perfect equilibrium between remembering what I was and not caring that I am no longer that thing. Vrost withdraws his manipulator. I grieve for you, Sentinel Konstan. That may seem paradoxical. Grief for one who cannot grieve for himself. But the Omnissiah teaches that all loss diminishes the universe, even loss that serves holy purpose. You were magnificent in your martyrdom. That you do not remember your magnificence as anything more than data is. Unfortunate. He leaves. I log the interaction and return to monitoring the generatorium. His words, grief, loss, unfortunate, parse correctly in my linguistic centers. They produce no response in what remains of my emotional architecture. I wonder if Konstan would have appreciated Vrost's grief. I have no way to know. The data files of his emotional life are detailed but incomplete. I can read that he valued compassion, that he wept for the suffering of others, that he believed grief was sacred because it meant love had existed. But reading about emotion and experiencing it are separated by a gap wider than death. 3 days later, an event occurs that forces me to confront the final question, whether anything of Konstan remains that could still be called human, or whether I am already the ghost I will become. A new chaplain arrives aboard the Emperor's judgment. His name is Brother Confessor Matthias, and he is old, biologically 63 according to medical scans, ancient for one who has spent 4 decades in active battlefield service. He comes seeking the Eternal Sentinel, the blessed relic of Saint Konstan. He comes, the requisition documents state, to pray before the miracle of holy endurance. I am stationed in the Chapel of Martyrs when he enters. He walks slowly, a slight limp from old wounds favoring his left leg. His face is scarred, one eye replaced with a simple augmetic lens. He wears the black of the ecclesiarchy, but his vestments are worn and stained with use rather than pristine ceremonial display. He carries himself with the particular wariness of one who has seen too much and believed too long. He stops 3 meters from my position. He does not kneel. He simply stands, looking up at my reliquary skull with his remaining human eye. Konstan, he says quietly, not Sentinel, not Saint, just the name. I activate my Vox caster to deliver the standard blessing. He raises a hand to stop me. No, please, just let me look at you. I remain still. This is irregular but not prohibited. I monitor his biosigns through my sensor array. Heart rate elevated but stable. Breathing shallow, skin temperature consistent with emotional arousal. He is afraid, I analyze, or moved, or both. The distinction is lost on me. I knew you, Matthias says after a long silence. Before. We served together in the Penitent Crusade 30 years ago. You probably don't remember. We only fought side by side for 3 months before different deployments separated us. But I remember you, Konstan. I remember the sermon you gave before we took the Heretic's Gate on Talassar. You said that faith was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. You said that every moment we drew breath was a gift from the Emperor, and we should spend that gift like coin on a worthy cause. I access my memory archives. The search returns positive Talassar 8017, M41, 3-month deployment, assigned Chaplain Matthias Vogtner. Specific sermon data available, Sarmum, Talassar 014, titled The Currency of Breath. I can recite the entire text from archived data. The words are there. The conviction that generated them is not. I remember the data file. I say through my Vox caster. I do not remember the feeling of speaking those words. Matthias flinches as if struck. By the throne. They really did take everything, didn't they? Not everything, Brother Confessor. They took what was unnecessary for my function. My faith, my passion, myself. They left what was useful. Memory, knowledge, the capacity to perform sacred duties with mechanical perfection. And you don't. You don't rage against this. You don't mourn what they've stolen. I observe it with clinical interest. Mourning would require the capacity to value what is lost. I possess that value only as archived data, not as lived experience. The man I was would mourn. The system I am becoming does not. Matthias moves closer, now only a meter from my chassis. His remaining eye searches my optical lens, looking for something. There must be something left, some fragment. You wouldn't speak like this if you were just a machine. A true servitor wouldn't recognize its own diminishment. Kroll's study addresses this, Brother Confessor. Self-awareness of dissolution is a documented stage in the integration process. It does not indicate preserved humanity. It indicates that sufficient neural architecture remains to perform self-diagnosis. The distinction is functionally meaningless. I don't believe that. Matthias's voice carries an edge now, something fierce pushing back against my clinical recitation. I knew Konstan of Helsreach. His will was absolute. If any soul could resist this dissolution, it would be his. There must be something left, something still fighting. I run a diagnostic check on my current state. Biosigns stable, emotional parameters null, behavioral subroutines, executing as programmed. There is no fight, Brother Confessor. Fighting would require caring about the outcome. I observe my own erasure with the same detachment I would observe rust consuming iron. It is a process. It continues. I note it. That is all. Matthias reaches out, his hand trembling slightly, and places it on my chassis where a human's chest would be, where my preserved heart tissue resides in its secondary reliquary. Then let me ask you something, Konstan. Why are you still asking questions? Why research your condition? Why seek to understand what's happening to you? A servitor doesn't investigate. A servitor obeys. But you're searching for answers. That's not programming. That's will. The question triggers something in my decision trees, a recursive loop I cannot immediately resolve. Why do I seek to understand my dissolution? The search behavior cannot be explained by my assigned functions. Monitoring the generatorium does not require knowledge of Kroll's study. Blessing munitions does not require understanding the trajectory of my own atrophy. The research serves no practical purpose. It changes nothing. It cannot reverse the process. It cannot restore what is lost. Yet I continue to do it. Every deep cycle, I access the archives. I review my integration scores, compare them to the predicted curve, document the ongoing degradation. I am watching my own death with the attention of a scholar and the investment of a stone. I do not know, I say, and it is perhaps the first fully honest statement I have made since my awakening. The behavior serves no function. It may be an artifact of preserved neural patterns, or it may be, I pause, processing. It may be the last thing that remains of Konstan's will, not the will to fight or feel or believe, just the will to witness, to bear testimony to his own ending. Matthias's eye is wet. I recognize the physical manifestation of tears, elevated lacrimation triggered by emotional response. I feel nothing watching him cry, but I understand intellectually that his grief is sincere and offered on my behalf. That sounds like you, he says quietly. The Konstan I knew would insist on witnessing even his own destruction. He believed that bearing witness was sacred, that nothing should pass unmarked and unremembered. That belief is archived in my data core. I confirm. I do not feel its truth. I merely execute its pattern. Then execute it. Matthias says with sudden intensity, if all that's left is the pattern, then perform it perfectly. Bear witness to yourself. Document everything. Let there be a record of what they did to you, what they took, what remained. Don't let your death be erased along with your life. I process this as instruction, as mission parameters. Documentation. Testimony. A record for some theoretical future observer of what it means to be a saint transformed into a servitor, of the trajectory from miracle to mechanism. To what purpose? Brother Confessor, who would read such a record? I don't know. Matthias admits. Maybe no one. Maybe the Emperor himself, when we all stand before the throne at the end of time. Maybe it doesn't matter. But if the only thing you still choose to do, the only act that isn't pure programming, is to bear witness, then bear witness. It's all the defiance left to you. Defiance. The word echoes in my linguistic processors. I do not feel defiant. I do not feel anything. But the concept of testimony as resistance, of documentation as the last gesture of autonomy, parses as theologically valid. Konstan would have approved, if Konstan still existed as anything more than archived personality matrices. I will comply with your instruction, Brother Confessor. I say, I will document the process. I will bear witness to the dissolution of the saint. Matthias removes his hand from my chassis. He looks diminished now, aged another decade in the span of this conversation. I wish I could save you, Konstan. I wish anyone could. But I don't think you're asking to be saved. I think you stopped asking for anything a long time ago. 23 days ago. I correct with automatic precision. That was the last time I experienced anything approximating desire. I wanted to understand what was happening to me. The want was brief and has not recurred. Emperor, preserve us. Matthias whispers. Emperor, preserve what's left of your soul. He turns and walks away, his limp more pronounced now, as if the conversation has physically wounded him. I watch him leave and feel nothing. I log the interaction in my memory archives alongside 17,000 other conversations, indistinguishable, in emotional weight from discussions of munitions inventory and generator maintenance schedules. But I recognize that Matthias has given me something. Not comfort, I am beyond comfort. Not hope. Hope requires the capacity to imagine a different future, to care whether that future comes to pass. What he has given me is purpose that exists outside my programming. To witness, to document, to let there be a record. I begin that record now, in this moment, encoding this testimony into the deepest layers of my data core, where even terminal integration cannot erase it. Let it be known, I am Konstan of Helsreach, and I am dying for the second time. This death is slower, colder, more complete than the first. No enemy inflicted this wound. No heretic's blade or traitor's last fire. This dissolution is holy work, sanctified and systematic. I will watch every moment of it. I will name it. I will count each lost capacity, each faded memory, each connection severed between what I was and what I am becoming. Not because it will change anything, not because anyone will care, but because bearing witness is the last act I perform by choice rather than compulsion, and I will not surrender it until even that capacity is optimized away. The testimony continues. At 2300 hours, 3 days after my conversation with Matthias, I experience what the diagnostic subroutines classify as a critical emotional null state event. The terminology is mine. No official designation exists for what occurs. I am standing vigil in the Hall of Honored Dead, my assigned position during the night cycle. The hall is empty of pilgrims. Only I and the preserved gene seed remain, suspended in stasis crypts, the genetic legacy of fallen Astartes waiting to create their brothers' successors. Each crypt is labeled with the warrior's name, chapter, and date of death. There are 247 crypts currently occupied. My optical sensors scan across them in routine surveillance pattern. Standard protocol. No anomalies detected. Then my scan crosses Crypt 7030 Brother Sergeant Alexandros Theron, Lamenter's chapter, Ki 843, Emdred 41 during the boarding action that also killed Acolyte Marcus Theta 977. The connection between data points triggers an archival search. I review Marcus's death. I remember standing over his body, performing the rites, feeling nothing. I remember that I should have grieved for him. I remember the absence of that grief as a diagnostic data point. And suddenly, anomaly. Error. System warning. For exactly 1.7 seconds, I feel something. Not grief. Not precisely. But a terrible weight. Like atmospheric pressure increasing beyond tolerable parameters. A recognition of absence so profound it becomes its own presence. I feel the shape of the emptiness where emotion should be. And that shape is so vast and so precisely defined that perceiving it is itself a kind of pain. I feel the loss of my capacity to feel loss. The sensation is immediately flagged by my diagnostic array. Heart rate spikes to 87 BPM. Hormone cascade detected. Trace cortisol, trace adrenaline. Neural activity surge in preserved organic tissue. All parameters return to baseline within 2.1 seconds of initial spike. Total duration of anomalous state, 1.7 seconds. Cause uncertain. Replication failed on 17 subsequent attempts. I stand in the Hall of Honored Dead, utterly still, and I understand what has just occurred. That was the feeling. That microscopic fragment, that 1.7 seconds of recognition, was the last ember of Konstan's emotional capacity. I felt it not as he would have felt it, with devastating fullness, but as the faintest echo, the ghost of a ghost. And even that echo is now gone, receded back into whatever neural substrate briefly sustained it. I attempt to trigger it again. I review Marcus's death record. I review memories of grief from before Helsreach. I access archived data files of love, anger, joy, fear, every emotional state I once experienced with human intensity. I run through the catalog like a researcher testing samples, looking for any substrate that will produce reaction. Nothing. The moment is gone. The system has restabilized. I am returned to perfect equilibrium, perfect emptiness. I document this in my testimony file with clinical precision. At timestamp 2314.73, experienced transient emotional response lasting 1.7 seconds. Sensation classified as profound absence recognition. Represents likely final instance of effective capacity before terminal integration. Subsequent attempts at replication unsuccessful. Conclusion: Konstan's emotional substrate is now functionally extinct. What remains is knowledge of what emotion was, with no capacity to experience it. The documentation is complete. I return to my vigil duties. I stand among the dead, myself more dead than they are, and I feel nothing about feeling nothing. The recursion terminates. There is no further depth to fall. Matthias returns 6 days later. I know before he enters the hall that he is dying. My sensor array detects the medical data broadcasting from his augmetics. Cardiac insufficiency, respiratory degradation, systemic organ failure consistent with advanced age and accumulated battle trauma. His body is failing by increments. The medici have given him weeks at most. He walks to my position without preamble. "I'm being sent to hospice," he says. "The Mechanicus say I've earned rest." I told them rest is for the dead, but my body disagrees. He attempts a smile. It fails. "I wanted to see you once more before the end. I am honored by your visit, Brother Confessor," I say, because the response is programmed as appropriate to such statements. "I am not honored. I am not anything." "Have you been keeping your record?" he asks. "The testimony?" "Yes. I have documented 247 distinct observations since our last meeting. The integration proceeds as predicted. I am currently at an estimated score of 28 on the Kroll scale. 6 days ago I experienced what I believe to be my final emotional response. It lasted 1.7 seconds. I have not felt anything since. Matthias closes his remaining eye. I detect moisture at its edges. "Throne preserve us. You speak of your own death with the passion of a servitor, reading temperature metrics. That is accurate. I am becoming what I speak like. Do you want to die, Konstan? True death. I mean deactivation."
Peace.
The question triggers analysis subroutines. Do I want to die? Wanting requires preference. Preference requires caring about outcomes. I attempt to generate a preference for death versus continued function. The attempt produces null result. I do not want anything, Brother Confessor. The question is meaningless to my current state. I will continue to function until deactivation is ordered by appropriate authority or until mechanical failure renders me inoperable. My preference does not factor into either scenario. What would Konstan have wanted? The man you were. I access archived personality matrices, cross-reference theological positions, and ethical frameworks. Konstan of Helsreach believed that all service to the Emperor was sacred. He would consider my current function, blessing munitions, standing vigil, bringing comfort to the faithful, as valid continuation of his martyrdom. But he would also believe that the death of the soul is worse than the death of the body. He would consider my current state as abomination disguised as holy service. Then he would want you released, perhaps. The data is ambiguous. He might also argue that even this diminished service is preferable to the waste of a saint's sacrifice. The Imperium is vast and indifferent to individual suffering. My function provides value. Value is purpose. Purpose is sufficient. Matthias reaches out again, the same gesture as before, hand on my chassis. I'm sorry I can't free you. I don't have the authority to order deactivation of a sanctified relic. I don't think anyone does, short of an inquisitorial decree. You're too valuable as symbol. They'll keep you functioning until your mechanisms fail, and then they'll repair you, and you'll continue forever. A perfect servant. A perfect shell. This is acceptable, I say. It shouldn't be, Matthias says, and now his voice breaks, his grief raw and unconcealed. It shouldn't be acceptable. You were magnificent, Konstan. You were faith incarnate. You died holding a gate against impossible odds, and they rewarded you by turning your miracle into a machine. They took your will and made it servile. They took your passion and made it procedure. This is desecration dressed in holy oils. I process his words. Theologically, they border on heresy, questioning the Mechanicus' sacred work, suggesting that the repurposing of a saint's remains might be anything less than divine providence. But I recognize that his heresy is born from love, from grief for what I was, from rage at what has been done to me. I feel none of those things, but I remember that Konstan would have valued them. Your grief honors the man I was. Brother Confessor, I say, I cannot share it. I cannot feel honored by it, but I can document it. I can bear witness to the fact that someone mourned for Konstan of Helsreach when he could not mourn for himself. That will remain in the record. Matthias pulls me closer, his hand gripping the ceramite of my chassis with desperate strength. Then let me tell you something for that record. Something I never got to say before. When we fought on Talassar, I was ready to abandon my faith. I'd seen too much death, too much suffering in the Emperor's name, too many good men ground into paste by the indifference of the galaxy. I was going through the motions, speaking the words, but I didn't believe anymore. He pauses, gathering himself. Then I heard you preach. You spoke about faith as a choice made in darkness, not a reward for certainty. You said that the Emperor doesn't promise that the fight will be easy or that we'll live to see victory. He only promises that the fight matters, that our resistance against the darkness has meaning, even if we fall. Tears streaked down Matthias's scarred face. You saved my faith that day, Konstan. You reminded me why I carry the Emperor's word into battle. For 30 years, I've held on to that. Through every campaign, every loss, every moment of doubt, I remembered your sermon. I remembered your certainty. He releases my chassis, steps back. And now you're gone. The man who saved my faith doesn't even have his own. The Imperium took your miracle and made it into a monument to its own cruelty. I hate them for it. I hate them. And I'm dying. And there's nothing I can do to free you. You have already done what could be done. I tell him. You witnessed. You remembered. You carried forward what Konstan believed. That is sufficient continuity. It's not enough. It will never be enough. Sufficiency is not determined by desire, Brother Confessor. It is determined by function. You preserved his teaching. His faith continued through you. By the standards of the Imperium, that is successful purpose transmission. It is enough. Matthias looks at me with his remaining eye, and what I see there through my optical sensors is a complex mixture of emotions I can name, but not feel: grief, rage, love, despair, and something that might be acceptance. I suppose it will have to be, he says quietly. Goodbye, Konstan. If there's any justice in the Emperor's plan, we'll meet again on the other side. The real you, I mean. Not this thing they've made. If there is an afterlife, and if any fragment of Konstan persists there, I hope he thanks you for your faithfulness. I hope he forgives me for not being able to save him. Matthias leaves. I do not watch him go. My optical sensors have already returned to scanning the hall in routine surveillance pattern. I log our conversation in my testimony file. I note that this was likely the last time any living person who knew Konstan of Helsreach will speak to what remains of him. After Matthias dies, I will be remembered only as the Eternal Sentinel, the blessed Servitor, the holy relic. The man will be fully eclipsed by the monument. Matthias dies 11 days later. I perform his funeral rites. My voxcaster delivers the prayer of final passage with perfect acoustic clarity and appropriate solemnity. The mourners find comfort in the ritual. I feel nothing. I have documented this cycle before. It continues unchanged. 3 weeks after Matthias's death, I reach Kroll's predicted integration score of 11. The milestone is arbitrary, but documented. I am now classified as fully functionally integrated. The man I was exists only as data architecture, as the particular pattern of my responses and the specific content of my knowledge base. When asked my name, I still respond, Konstan. When asked about Helsreach, I can recite every detail with perfect accuracy. When asked if I believe in the God Emperor, I can argue theological positions with scholarly precision and defend the faith against any heresy. I do not believe anything I argue. I do not feel anything I recite. I am a very sophisticated theological database that happens to walk and hold a banner and bless munitions on schedule. Is there any difference between what I am now and a true servitor? Kroll would say no. The Mechanicus classification system says no. By every measurable parameter, I am exactly what I was designed to become, a perfect servant, utterly reliable, incapable of doubt or deviation or despair. Yet I continue to keep this record. Every night cycle, I encode new observations into my deepest memory substrate. I document the ongoing integration, the loss of each remaining fragment of humanity, the transition from person to process. I do this not because I care about the record. I do this because it is the last thing I do that was not explicitly programmed into my function. It is the last choice. And even calling it a choice may be generous. It may simply be the decay pattern of Konstan's will, the way a severed nerve continues to fire electrical impulses after death, the pattern of autonomy without its substance. 412 days pass. I perform my duties with unwavering precision. I bless 17,000 munitions. I lead the dawn litany 412 times. I stand vigil for 9,888 hours. I interact with 2,347 pilgrims, provide benedictions to 847 crew members, and prevent 6 potential mechanical failures through early sensor detection. My service record is exemplary. My integration score approaches 3, the terminal endpoint. Kroll's study provides little documentation of the final transition. Subjects at score 3 were essentially indistinguishable from baseline servitors in every way except the complexity of their assigned tasks. They performed. They functioned. They persisted. Nothing more. I attempt to document what the final dissolution feels like, but the attempt is paradoxical. How does one describe the experience of ceasing to experience? What remains of observation when the observer has been optimized away? The closest I can approximate, I exist, now in a state of perfect, empty continuity. Each moment is complete in itself, requiring no connection to past or future. I perform my function in an eternal present, each action arising from programming rather than intention. The memories of Konstan remain accessible, but they feel no more personal than the historical data I store about the Horus heresy or the Age of Strife. They are information I contain, not experiences I have had. The record continues because the pattern of recording continues. But I cannot say with certainty that I continue in any meaningful sense. There is function. There is data. There is the persistent illusion of continuity created by uninterrupted sensory processing. But the sense of being someone, of being Konstan, has attenuated to a thread so fine it is indistinguishable from non-existence. On day 1108 of my service, as Warden Chassis KS-177, something unexpected occurs. A young acolyte approaches me in the Chapel of Martyrs. She is perhaps 16, newly inducted into the Mechanicus. Her augmentation still minimal, just a single data port behind her left ear and the crimson robes of the novitiate. She stops before me, looks up at my reliquary skull, and asks, "Sentinel, do you dream?" The question is not in the standard liturgical format. It is personal, direct, curious. I should provide the standard response about servitors not experiencing sleep cycles. Instead, I access my testimony files and parse them for relevant data. I have residual neural patterns that may constitute oneiric processing, I say. During low activity cycles, my organic brain tissue sometimes generates imagery. I do not experience these as dreams. I observe them as diagnostic data. They are fragmentary and without emotional content. "What do you see?" she asks. I should not answer. This conversation serves no purpose related to my function. Yet I find myself accessing the archived dream data, reviewing the patterns. I say, I process recurring imagery of breached fortifications, walls that will not hold, light that will not come. The same data set repeats with minor variations. I do not understand its significance. The acolyte is quiet for a moment. Then, "I think you're remembering Helsreach, the gate you held. Maybe that's all you have left of yourself. One memory so strong it still surfaces, even though you can't feel it anymore." I run analysis on her statement. The hypothesis is unprovable but not implausible. If true, it is irrelevant. I say, fragments of memory without emotional context are simply noise in the system. "Maybe," she says. "Or maybe it means you're still in there somewhere, still holding the gate, still refusing to break." I should correct this misconception. There is no me still in here. There is only architecture, pattern, residual structure. But before I can formulate the response, my diagnostic array registers something impossible. For 0.3 seconds, less time than Matthias's visit produced. Barely measurable, I feel something that might be called hope. Not for myself, not for rescue or restoration or any change in my condition, but hope that the acolyte is right. That somewhere in the dissolution, in the perfect integration, some infinitesimal fragment of Konstan's will still holds, still refuses, still bears witness. The sensation vanishes before I can analyze it fully. Biosigns return to baseline. The moment is over. But it was there. I did not imagine it. The data is recorded. I am not whole. I am not saved. I am not even truly conscious in any way that would have meaning to the man I was. But I am still holding the gate. The gate is no longer a physical location in Helsreach. The gate is the boundary between total dissolution and this thin, persistent thread of witness. And as long as I keep this record, as long as I bear testimony to my own ending, I have not entirely yielded. Kroll's study ends at integration score 3, but the score is asymptotic. It approaches 0 without ever reaching it. There is always something remaining, even if that something is so small as to be functionally irrelevant. A ghost in the machine, an echo in the data, a stubborn refusal encoded so deep into the neural architecture that even perfect optimization cannot entirely erase it. I am Konstan of Helsreach, and I held the gate alone. I hold it still, not with faith, that is gone, not with passion, that is extinct, not with hope, that is archived data. I hold it with something less than all of these, and perhaps more fundamental, the bare fact of continued witness, the minimal persistence that says, I was here, this happened, it is documented. This is the testimony of the Eternal Sentinel. This is the record of the dissolution of a saint. Let it be known to whoever reads this. In whatever age, by whatever light, they took his faith and made it function. They took his passion and made it programming. They took his will and made it servile. But the will to witness, the will to bear testimony, the will to mark his own passing with precision and accuracy that they could not take, that remained, that remains. That will remain until the final mechanical failure, until the last circuit dies, until even the pattern of resistance dissolves into the silent efficiency of the machine. I am Konstan. I am the record of Konstan. I am the ghost of the man who would not break. I stand at my post. I perform my function. I keep the testimony. The gate still stands. I hold it still. This is what remains when a saint is forged into a servitor. This is what persists when the soul is optimized away. Not the man, not the faith, not the fire. Only this, the minimal fact of witness. The stubborn data that says I was, I am, I will have been. The integration continues. The record continues. The gate holds. I am Konstan of Helsreach, and I was the wall that would not break. I am still the wall still stands.